Aloha, my name is Kapono. Today I want to talk about Hawaii and fire. In this image, which I took about 4 years ago from my hometown of Waikoloa in Hawaii, we can see a wildfire which threatened the community. It's actually a fairly common occurrence not only for my hometown but for many communities across Hawaii. Today I want to talk about some of the environmental factors that have created such a risk for these communities and speak towards those factors in Lāhainā and its recent disaster. In this video, I'm going to start by providing context. I'm going to provide everybody a quick, brief overview about Hawaii's natural setting and recent history. I'll then go into some of the trends about fires in Hawaii, the reasons for those trends, and some of the current drivers of fires. I'll then talk about Lāhainā, the history of the town, its environment, and the conditions the day of the disaster. I'm making this video roughly a week after the disaster. A lot of the facts have yet to be established, so in this video I'm not going to be speaking much about the actual fire itself. I'm going to be speaking about the conditions leading up to the fire. Finally, I'm going to close out with what can be done. I want to talk about some of the pre- and post-fire actions that might be able to reduce the threat that our communities have here in Hawaii due to wildfires. Getting into Hawaii setting, the first thing I want to talk about is rain. Some general knowledge for everybody out there across the world that might be tuned into Hawaii and not know much about how our environment works. In Hawaii, we have across the islands in general a dry side of the island called the leeward side and a wet side of the island called the windward side. Here we can see a picture of the Big Island, in which that stark wet and dry side are made obvious. The right side of the image being that wet green side and the left side being that leeward dry side. My town is actually located on the left side of this image in that dry leeward side of the island. The reason we have such a stark difference in how much rain we get across the island is largely due by our trade winds and something called the inversion zone. In Hawaii, throughout most of the year, we have a wind that's blowing out of the northeast. We call this one the trade winds. This wind comes up to Hawaii, bringing with it warm, moist air, which then hits the island and is pushed up by the mountains into something called the inversion zone, which is basically where the warm, moist air meets cold air coming down from the atmosphere, causing that warmer air to condense, create clouds, and drop rain. As those winds are coming from predominantly one side of the island throughout the year, that rain ends up falling on that one side of the island, creating a stark difference in how much water there is between the leeward and the windward sides of the island. Second thing to know is that we have a dry season which occurs between April and September and a wet season occurring between October and March. Between those two seasons, there's roughly 4 to 2 times more rain during the wet season than there is during the dry season. What these factors playing together means is that there's a massive variation in the amount of rainfall we get, not only across Hawaii, but on each island. What I mean by that can be seen here on the right, the image of Maui showing how much annual rainfall parts of the islands get. Some parts of the island getting around 10 inches of rain a year, while other parts can receive upwards of 400 inches of rain per year. And these are very close together areas. There's only a few miles separating some of those extremely rainy areas from some of those extremely dry areas. Final factor is that we have droughts that are becoming more common and worse. On the right, we can see the trends in our annual rainfall from 1920 up to 2012. In some areas, we've actually had between 15 and 8% loss of rain, a reduction in how much rainfall we get per decade. So each decade, there will be about 8 to 15% less rain than there was the previous decade, continuing since 1920 till now. There's a few areas where that rain has actually increased, but for the vast majority of Hawaii, we've seen a lot less rain over the past century, longer droughts, and more common droughts. Now that we've covered the rain, we can talk about our wind, which is just about as variable as our rain is. Some areas we have an average wind of about 0.3 meters a second, other areas up to 7 meters a second, which is extremely fast. Furthermore, we have storms that bring peak winds, and sometimes these storms bring winds without any rain, as was the case last week. On the right, we can see Hurricane Dora, Category 4 hurricane that passed to the south of Hawaii a week ago. On the left, we can see a graph of the average wind on Maui. We can see that on Tuesday the 8th, which is actually the day of that fire in Lāhainā, there's a peak average wind of about 32 miles per hour. So throughout the day, there was a constant wind of somewhere around 30 miles per hour, not speaking towards the gusts, which are up and above that. In this instance, that hurricane passed to the south of us, creating a low pressure zone. To the north of us was a high pressure zone, meaning that we had a strong wind blowing from the north down to the south. With the context about our environment covered a little bit, we can speak towards the history of land use and how that has spread invasive species, largely associated with agricultural decline, to create fire-prone landscapes. There's another image I took from Waikoloa, a different fire. Actually, see the smoke in the upper area coming from above me. I'm looking down towards the ocean. In the foreground and background of this image, all the grass you're seeing is non-native or invasive. Basically, this area used to be a dryland forest in which native species created a literal forest in this area. Well, currently, it's a desolate, dry grassland. Hawaii is often called the extinction capital of the world, and for good reason. We contain 0.25% of the area claimed by the United States, but we contain 30% of all the listed species that are threatened or endangered. The issue of invasive plants largely stems from the fact that they outcompete our natives. An area where native species are lost, whether it be by fire or disturbance of some humankind, what ends up coming back quickly is invasive species. So in this area, where there used to be a dryland forest, as that forest was gone, what took over was invasive grasslands, which can outcompete any of the native species. When we're talking about disturbance of land, a lot of that has been caused by agriculture. At the time, agriculture was one of the most important parts of our economy, so we had a lot of land that was cleared out to make room for agricultural operations. But with the loss of those agricultural operations, particularly the collapse of our sugarcane industry, what we ended up with is a lot of land that's left fallow or abandoned, in which the species that come back are those non-native invasive species, which outcompete any of the native ones. On the right, we can see two graphs illustrating how that sugarcane industry has collapsed. This industry peaked around the 1980s. If you look on the bottom right graph, the number of acres actually being cultivated peaked early in the 1930s, topping out around 140,000 acres, and then collapsing in the late 80s, falling down to about 20,000 acres. That collapse has meant is that there's 120,000 acres of land potentially now covered in invasive species like dry grasslands, should those areas not be used for other purposes, which is largely the case in Hawaii. Similarly to this industry is the amount of rangeland that's actually being used for cattle cultivation, which has been largely reduced or left abandoned in many areas across Hawaii, meaning that there's these large swaths of land that are being essentially unmanaged, in which invasive species move in, creating prime conditions for fire. Half of Hawaii's land is actually designated for agricultural uses. 8% of that half has active crops being grown on it. 80% of that total half is designated for rangelands. The result of these and other factors is that there is a vast amount of land that is taken over by non-native and invasive species, creating prime conditions for fires. In this image here, I took this in Waimea. It's a town above Waikoloa that I spoke about earlier. All this land, or most of it, is owned by Parker Ranch, which runs cattle in the area. Historically, they run cattle throughout this entire area, but as rain has become less and less frequent, a lot of this landscape has become more and more dry. In the foreground, where it's nice and moist and green, cows can come through here and keep that fuel level down. But in the background, where it's just so dry that nothing can really grow except invasive species, cows aren't nearly as likely to be put there because the quality of feed is just so low, meaning that year after year, these invasive species grow, die, until you have prime conditions for a fire. So these invasive species, these abandoned agricultural areas, have combined to create fire-prone landscapes. 25% of all of our land now consists of quick-burning grass. On the right, this is actually in the foreground of the last photo I took. On the background of that upper image, you can see the mountain that I took that photo from. Here we are in that dry grassland that I just spoke about. This was taken around the same time that I took this background nighttime photo. In the bottom right here, we can see the firefighters trying to fight this fire, in which the flames are catching through this grass, moving at a rapid speed, becoming enormous because of how much fuel there is in this area. So we have 25% of our land that consists of this dry, quick-burning grass. Roughly 50% of our land is these dry leeward areas, and we have drought conditions that are making this situation worse and worse. Furthermore, we have a dry season that's overlapping with a storm season, meaning that if a fire occurs during the dry season, there's a chance that it will be during a storm in which the winds are much higher than the average, meaning the fire is going to move far faster than it would otherwise through a landscape that's quick burning grass. Couple that with the fact that we have warmer yearly temperatures and record heats in some areas each summer. Since the 1950s, we've seen a 2.5 degree Fahrenheit increase in the average temperature of Hawaii. Now we can talk about some of the trends about Hawaii and our fires. Biggest takeaway, fires are more common and larger than ever. We now have more than 1,000 fires a year, which burn on average over 20,000 acres. On the right, we can see an image of the Big Island and where our fires are occurring on that island. Also mapped as areas that are covered in trees versus areas that are covered in grass. The vast majority of our fires we can see here are in those grasslands, occurring time and time again in the leeward side of the island, particularly where there's large amounts of invasive grass species. Our fire departments are able to actually contain about 90% of these fires to less than an acre, but that means that there's 100 fires that are accounting for about 19,000 acres being burned on average each year. And on bad years, Hawaii actually leads the United States for the percent of land that's being burnt by wildfires. On this bottom right graph, you can see the amount of acres burned each year since this data set has been created around 1904. We can see that not only are the fires occurring more frequently, but they're occurring in larger amplitudes, meaning that our fires are becoming larger and more frequent as time goes by. The majority of our fires are caused by human ignitions. In historical times, most of the fires were caused by things like lightning strikes, but nowadays it's human activity. On the right, we can see a mapping of the fires and a mapping of the roads, and you can see that most of the fires are contained around areas where there's either a road or a town, meaning that human ignitions are the primary cause for most of our fires. Some areas, this can be as high as there being 36 ignitions per square mile per year, meaning that there's 35 fires started in some areas per year. I believe that 36 number comes from a particular part of Oahu. On the left, we can see an image of Maui showing how much fires are started with a peak of about 3.6 fires per square mile per year. Lāhainā existing on the left side of that Maui image in one of those high frequency areas. What we have is basically a feedback loop, where as fires become more common, as more people are visiting and living in Hawaii, creating more and more fires, inevitably these fires become larger. They burn areas that have once been native forests. Those native forests are lost, making room for more invasive species, making room for more fires, which are then again started with more frequencies. Now with that context provided to all of you, I can now dive into a little bit about the conditions around and in Lāhainā. I'm going to talk about the land use history and the environmental setting of Lāhainā, as well as the day of conditions for the fire. Again, this is an ongoing disaster. I'm making this video about a week after that fire. There's a lot of sadness and trauma going around, and there's not many facts established. So I'm not going to be talking about the fire itself in much detail. I'm going to be focusing on the pre-fire conditions that existed and might have put this town at such high risk for wildfires. Lāhainā was actually the capital of the Kingdom of Hawaii once it was moved from Pelekane in the early 1800s to Lāhainā. It stayed the capital until 1845 or so, when it was moved to Honolulu on Oahu. During the 1800s to 1860s, it was predominantly a major whaling and fishing port. Sugar plantations became the largest economic factor starting around the 1860s until they collapsed around the year 1999. Lahaina's modern environment is extremely dry. It exists on the leeward side of the island, and it has summer rains that average anywhere between 0.8 inches a month to 0.08 inches a month, meaning some months out of the year, Lahaina is effectively not getting any rain at all. What we end up with, we can see here in these Google Maps satellite images, where Lahaina town is surrounded by extremely dry grasslands. A factor exacerbating these issues is the water diversions that occur all throughout Maui. For the past 100+ years, there's been this complex system of water diversions that have been built to feed private industries. Sometimes they're used for public uses now as well. But what inevitably has happened is that the water for this community has been diverted and taken elsewhere, meaning that not only is it existing in this dry ecosystem, but it's drier than it would be normally because the water that would have come down through these streams are being diverted and taken elsewhere. After the collapse of that sugarcane industry, most of those fields ended up having nothing grown in them, which means that what took over are those invasive and non-native grasslands. See these pictures here of just Lahaina on the left side, dry grassland surrounding the town. When these factors combine, Lahaina ends up being in the top 8% of all communities throughout the U.S. in regards to risk of wildfire. On the upper right, we can see an instance of a fire that occurred last year, which burnt 2,000 acres. With these environmental facts established, we can talk about the day of the disaster. We know the community of Lahaina was at high risk for wildfire, and the day of the fire on the 8th, Hurricane Dora passed to the south of the islands, bringing with it 30-mile-per-hour constant winds and even higher gusts. Furthermore, that storm didn't bring any rain with it to Lahaina, and the conditions of the day were hot at about 88 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire itself started in the afternoon, running through the night. Not only was there a fire in Lahaina, but there's multiple fires all across Maui and on other islands as well. I know of at least 3 on Maui, and I think there's 3 more on the Big Island and more on other islands as well. On the bottom right, we can see a satellite image showing where the fires were the night of the 8th to the morning of the 9th. We can see 3 fires, the left one being Lahaina, 2 more in the center of the island. So day of the disaster, we have a community on the dry leeward side of the island during the summer, surrounded by highly flammable and invasive grass with high wind conditions because of a hurricane passing to the south, and a town consisting of historic buildings that are flammable and closely packed together. These factors also combine to make it difficult for people to fight this fire. Because of the high winds, the fire department couldn't likely use helicopters, which are the most often and effective used methods to fight wildfires in Hawaii. Furthermore, they had to respond to multiple fires throughout the island. This fire was moving fast. Wildfires moving typically at the speed of the wind, meaning that this fire could potentially move upwards of 30 miles per hour, which is about 6 times faster than the average person can run. And it was soon to be dark, compounding all these issues as people would not be able to see what they were doing. Again, facts of this fire are yet to be established, so I'm not going to be speaking towards any of the day issues. I just want to provide context to the conditions that existed in and around Lahaina the day of the disaster. While this is not entirely settled yet, we know some of the early results of this fire. This is the worst natural disaster in recorded history of Hawaii. It's the most fatal U.S. fire in the past 100 years, and the community has been destroyed in less than a few hours. Lives have been lost, homes have been lost, and the history of this community has been lost. You can imagine all the places that you're connected to and how those memories form around those places and things. Fire has basically taken away all of that. And in a community with such historic significance, you might have multiple generations of people with stories about objects, places, buildings that have essentially been lost because of this fire destroying that connection. I mean, the very fabric of this community has been affected by the fact that it's not only have people's homes and lives been lost, but that history that makes up a community has been lost. To close this video off, I want to talk about some of the things that can be done with a focus on pre-fire and post-fire actions and a change in the perspective of how we view and act about wildfires in Hawaii. This is by no means a comprehensive list of all the options that are available. These are just some of the thoughts that I had now while making this video. For pre-fire preparation, the first thing, most immediately obvious, is the reducing of fuel, specifically in these unused ag lands. Lots of area throughout Hawaii is just left fallow, which means we have a buildup of these invasive species and fuel. We need to be able to use those lands in some capacity so that it's not just covered in unmanaged burnable grassland. Fire breaks provide not only a delay, allows firemen to actually get and fight the fire, it allows a place for firemen to concentrate their efforts. It provides them access to an area that would be otherwise hardly accessible, and it provides the community time to evacuate. I think I've been evacuated 4 or 5 times from Waikoloa at this point. Fire break in this instance might have saved the town from being consumed by this particular wildfire. Increasing the amount of fire breaks we have is a quick way that we can at least mitigate some of the effects of these fires. While I might not be able to stop all of our fires, it can at least provide time to the firefighters and residents to take action and an area for firefighters to concentrate their efforts. Interagency, private and scientific collaborations are needed, specifically focusing on actionable research, which can determine how we can respond to these fires, what sort of factors are playing into them being so bad, and providing insights that can be taken and turned into actual initiatives. These collaborations can facilitate a way for us to be able to manage these land in some way for areas that are technically privately or state owned, but are not being actively managed in any way and are covered in dry and invasive species. Finally, I want to speak about the need for community plans, specifically plans that provide agency and empower community members themselves to identify risky conditions and to identify when fires are occurring during those risky conditions, and then a mechanism for them to communicate that to the rest of the community. What I'm speaking towards here is the need for actual community member to have agency and empowerment to identify when there's risky conditions and to identify when there's fires occurring in those risky conditions and to communicate that to the community. Now I want to speak about some post-fire preparation we can take. What I want to speak about is highlighted here by this image on the right. This is a forest reserve in which native species are being protected and managed. It's nice and green, surrounded by a bunch of dry, invasive grasslands. If a fire comes through this area, it's likely to move far more slowly through this green foliage and trees than it would through straight grasslands where winds can just push it along at the speed of the wind. Fires actually provide a potential opportunity for these restoration efforts. And what I mean is that when you want to restore an area, the first thing you got to deal with is whatever invasives or non-natives are in that area. As a fire goes through that area, killing or destroying all those invasive and non-natives, you have open ground, meaning that there's an opportunity to quickly establish and replant native species in those areas. An emphasis on the rapid replanting of these native species near communities, and especially those with fires that are common around the community, could create essentially a natural fire break in which the easily burnable dry grasslands have a break between the community and the grasslands by these greener native species areas. To actually make this happen, we need some sort of seed bank in which seeds are planted and selectively chosen for natives that can be grown quickly and outcompete some of the invasive species that are going to regrow from whatever seeds are in the soil in the following year. And also logistics to get those seeds where they're needed so that they can be quickly put into the environment when a fire comes through and makes an area clear of invasive species for the time being. To make this happen, we really need a legal mechanism that enables community stewardship of commonly burnt landscapes. For a lot of these landscapes, it's simply unfeasible for communities to have to literally jump over a fence to get to the area to manage it themselves. Furthermore, they're technically now trespassing in these areas. For areas that are being commonly burnt year after year that aren't being actively managed or are just covered in invasive species, it'd be ideal if communities could have some legal mechanism that gives them access to these areas so that they can steward it in some capacity, thereby reducing the amount of fuel present in these areas and protecting the communities around them. Lastly, I want to talk about a change in how we perceive wildfires and the threats wildfires have towards our communities. This risk is very real for many communities throughout Hawaii, and it's not getting any better on its own. It'd be ideal if we could switch our perspective of how we manage this risk towards a more place-based planning and action mentality, which is then facilitated by a centralized governing body. For fires that are going to rapidly approach and potentially move through a community, it's unrealistic to expect a government agency to be able to respond in a timely fashion, to be able to initiate an evacuation of that area. Hopefully what we could have instead is a designated number of community members that have been trained to identify threatening conditions and have the agency to initiate an evacuation themselves without the need to first call in an official representative of the government to then initiate such a evacuation notice. Furthermore, for the planning of how preparation is taken, and especially the management of land, government can facilitate not only access to this land, but potentially facilitate the tools, the knowledge, and the seeds and the like to actually do that management. We need a greater emphasis on the planning and practice of emergency evacuations and potentially additional evacuation routes being added to many of our towns. This picture here of Waikoloa, during this fire, I think there was just a single road getting in and out of our town. Recently, we added a evacuation route to one side, which is basically a gravel road leading down towards a road near the ocean. But up until the time that was built, there's one way in and one way out of this town. Many communities in Hawaii have similar characteristics where there's one or two roads leading in and out of the town. If an evacuation route cannot be added directly, then some alternative mechanism, perhaps some area where you can have a reasonable expectation that the risk of a fire moving quickly through it is lowered, providing an alternative way to get out of the community or get away from the fire itself would be ideal. In conclusion, Hawaii is particularly prone to fire. The problem's been getting worse, not better. Lahaina is a horrifying example of when these risks become reality. There's hundreds of communities that are at similar risks and threatened by wildfire. This is a massive problem that can at least be mitigated to some extent by place-based and community-oriented solutions. Basically, the communities that are threatened and affected by these sorts of risks are likely those who are going to care most about mitigating those risks, and are likely those most capable of mitigating those risks, should they be empowered to do so. Thanks everybody for tuning in. This is by no means a conclusive recommendation list. This is just ideas that I had while making this video. I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts out there of people, how we can tackle this problem. I invite you to throw those into the comments. If you want me to make another video going into more detail about something or covering another topic, please likewise let me know in the comments. If you want to aid Lāhainā, there's some links in the description as well as a full list of the citations that I use for all my photographs and figures. This is a new channel that I hope to keep adding to in the very near future. I recently graduated from the University of Hawaii with a Master's of Environmental Management. I learned a ton while I was there. There's a lot of things I'd like to share with everybody. Furthermore, I'm starting a PhD. There's probably going to be a lot of things that I learned throughout that I'd like to share as well. If you're stopping in from my other channel, Shaka Fishing, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all again in the very near future. Ahui ho.